think everybody agrees there's a lot of inequality in the United States, but I often think, well, has this gotten worse or better over time? So in this video, I'm going to take a look at what inequality was like about 175 years ago, and then I'll leave it up to you to compare whether it's worse today, better today, or unchanged. And try to stick to the end of the video. We took a trip to the Hampton estate that I'm going to show you here, and there was something very surprising there, something that I've heard of but I've never seen. So check it out later in the video. Let's start first with what the privileged class had 175 years ago. The centerpiece of Hampton National Historic Site, the Hampton Mansion, was the holiday home of the Ridgeleys, the working place for many enslaved, and the architectural prominence that allowed Hampton to be preserved. Set atop the hill at the center of the park is Hampton Hall. As Captain Charles Ridgely's wealth expanded, he chose to establish a new seasonal retreat on the property. Construction of the five-part Georgian-style mansion began in 1783 under the oversight of builder and master carpenter Northampton Howe, who died in 1787. Local craftsmen, enslaved African Americans, and indentured servants labored to complete the massive undertaking. At its completion in 1790, with 24,000 square feet and 31 rooms, Hampton Hall was believed to be the largest private home in the country, and currently the mansion stands as one of the best surviving examples of Georgian architecture in the United States. The architecture of the mansion and landscape design are characterized by proportion, balance, and symmetry, and were intended to recreate a traditional European villa with an English aesthetic. Hampton Hall's relationship to the space and structures around it illustrates a sharp contrast in the history and culture of the surrounding landscape. Domestic service buildings surrounded the mansion to support the Jehu family's lifestyle. Formal gardens designed for leisure and recreation adorned the south side of the estate, while fields of hay, corn, and other crops were planted for profit and tended and harvested through the work of enslaved African Americans and indentured servants on the north side. By design, all these activities fall within sight of the cupola of Hampton Hall and its owners, and the sitting of the mansion clearly illustrates social hierarchy and relative status of those occupying the highlands and lowlands of Hampton. The Ridgeleys were actually prosperous enough to be able to have ice year-round. This subterranean ice house was built between 1783 and 1790 to the northwest of the mansion. Constructed with rubble stone with a brick dome roof covered with earth, the Hampton Ice House was designed and built to last for generations. It was larger and deeper than typical commercial ice pits during the historic period. The underground space was cylindrical and tapered towards the bottom. On the north side of the structure, a short passage opened up to the space below for loading ice. On the south side of the structure, a wider tunneled passage with steps provided access for ice retrieval. For years, every winter, enslaved people would go out to the ponds to cut up large cubes of ice and stack inside this structure, separating each piece with hay. With the storage being below ground and covered by both stone and earth, the ice created a natural refrigeration that would allow ice to be stored far into the summer. The falling garden attracts many to the site. With historic trees and maintained garden beds, the sites can be hard to imagine how much work went into creating the gardens. In 1859, noted horticulturalist William Winthrop Sargent wrote that it has been truly said of Hampton that it expresses more grandeur than any other place in America. Having visited Hampton Gardens at their most extensive and with the greatest variety, Sargent expressed truly unique landscape in its day. Hampton's gardens today are a living collection that tells several stories. Though intended for the enjoyment of the Ridgely family, Hampton's Gardens landscape was originally designed by Daniel Healy, an Irish-born gardener and indentured servant whose indenture was transferred to Captain Charles Ridgely in November 1784. Familiar with European landscape practices of the period, such as those outlined in John James' The Theory and Practice of Gardening, published in 1712, Healy supervised the creation of the 240-foot by 480-foot Great Terrace. The dimension of Healy's garden echoes the dimensions of the main block of Hampton Hall. With its clean lines and balanced use of space, the gardens reflect the same aesthetic qualities of the mansion architecture. Creating the dramatic overlook from the terrace required laborers to carve out of the hillside an 18-foot drop-off with tough ramps connecting the 6 layers with the terrace. The backbreaking work of crafting the landscape fell to enslaved African Americans and indentured servants. If you want to see how prosperous the Hampton plantation was, you need to look no further than the orangery. Constructed in the 1830s, the orangery was a true sign of the Ridgely's wealth and status. Citrus fruits, such as oranges and lemons, could not be grown outdoors in Maryland due to the harsh winters and the need for a warm climate. This greenhouse structure had a furnace underneath that it could warm up the building, creating a tropical atmosphere to allow the trees to grow and rare fruits to be on the plates for Ridgely guests. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea of how the privileged class, what there was their lifestyle, what was things like for them. And if you stuck with the video this long, I'd like to ask you to do me a favor. A little button right down there. It says subscribe. Click that subscribe button for me. I'd really appreciate it. And I think you can see that the benefits that the privileged class had came from being the largest slave-owning plantation in Maryland before the Civil War. So now that we've seen that side of it, let's walk basically across the street to the farm and see how it was for the not-so-privileged class. What you're seeing here is the mule barn. The mule barn housed mules, which were some of the most important livestock the Hamptons' farm work. The mule barn was part of John and Eliza Ridgely's transformation of the farm side to the Fermi-Orney style. It was built around 1851 to replace an earlier mule stable destroyed by fire. The 2-story building housed the primary work animals of the farm. Today, the mule barn is not open to the public, but rather is the designated parking area for the farm side of the park. Park picnic tables are located nearby for visitors to rest and enjoy a meal during their visit. Built in the 18th century, the lower house is the oldest extant building on the Hampton property. During the second half of the 18th century, the house served as a temporary residence while the Ridgleys were visiting their ironworks and later during construction of the mansion. Around 1745, the original 1-story structure was built. Later, it was expanded to include a 3-bay long addition to the north. Later in the 18th century, the older portion of the house was moved approximately 10 feet south, and a single-story link was built between the 2 portions. Renovations to the interior of the house were made in the second half of the 18th century, circa 1780, possibly to prepare the residence for Captain Charles Ridgely, while the mansion was under construction. In 1840, the lower house was expanded to include the 3-bay east wing, and porches were built on the east and south facades of the wing. Other alterations to the lower house during the 1800s, including the addition of a west porch, expansion of the kitchen in the 1800s, and replacement of the link by 1900. Alterations in the 20th century include installation of electricity and plumbing and the removal of the west porch. The lower house housed the farm overseer throughout the majority of the 19th century and the farm manager after the abolition of slavery in Maryland in 1864. During the 1900s, the lower house was known as the Huntsman's Lodge and served house guests who attended fox hunting events in Hampton. From 1948 until 1980, when the farm property was acquired by the National Park Service, the lower house was the residence of John Ridgely, Jr. and Jane Rodney. The farmhouse yard was fenced by 1745, likely to keep livestock at bay from the farmhouse, which was, until 1783, the primary Ridgely residence at Hampton. The outlying farm landscape was once lined with fences and hedgerows that defined quarters and fields. The portion of the West Farm Field remains and is planted annually by park staff with ryegrass, oats, or corn to evoke its historic agricultural character. This is the tenant farmers' quarters, originally built in 1854 with its twin next to it. This building was originally used to house enslaved people. Post Maryland's emancipation in November of 1864, these buildings were used to house paid tenant farmers working on the Hampton estate. This former enslavement quarters building is today set up to represent the appearance of the days of the tenant farmers. From the colonial period through 1864, the Ridgeleys enslaved over 500 African American men, women, and children. Enslaved persons, from young children to the elderly, labored in a wide variety of capacities at Hampton and Northampton as ironworkers, founders, limestone and marble quarriers, millers, blacksmiths, gardeners, dairymaids, jockeys, cobblers, seamstresses, woodcutters, field hands, carriage drivers, cooks, child care providers, cleaners, and builders. These cabins behind the overseer's house were built about 1854, made of stone cut from the Ridgely quarry. These stone structures are sturdier and larger than quarters on most other plantations of the time. They were built as duplex units with a central interior wall, so it is likely that a family lived in the two rooms on each side. Family life for many of the enslaved centered around the enslavement quarters. It was here that families ate meals of salted pork, corn, meal, fish, and beef. These meals may have been supplemented by fresh vegetables grown in small gardens behind the quarters. Stories told by the fireside might recall ancient African traditions. In these buildings, enslaved families could enjoy a limited amount of privacy and could speak freely, away from the watchful eyes of the overseer or the Ridgely family. The dairy was built between 1780 and 1800, renovated between 1830 and 1840, and was still in use until 1942. Built into a hill and low to the ground with a roof that extends over the edge of the building to maintain cooler temperatures inside it, it was designed to store milk and process butter. At the bottom of the stairs of the dairy is a grotto built over a natural spring. Water from this spring runs inside the building and into a basin. Milk stored in tall stoneware jars sat in the basin to be cold. Although a cold place during hot months, working the crank of a barrel churn was a monotonous task. Milking dozens of cows in the huge cattle barn, once located past the longhouse, took workers most of the day. Mrs. Croner described her father's task as a dairyman in the early 20th century. He took care of the cows, milked the cows, and got milk ready in the morning to take out to this lady, Miss Pink German. He'd get up at 4 in the morning. He had to get the cows milked. While it was common during the days of tenant farming for the dairy to be run by a dairyman, through over a century of slavery, enslaved women and paid female employees held the role of dairymaid, where their labor provided additional income for the Ridgeleys. In 1822, for instance, the Hampton dairy produced 4,296 pounds of butter commercially sold, netting a profit of close to $1,800. The dairymaid in this period was Millie Sheridan, who worked as a paid employee at Hampton after being granted her freedom in Governor Ridgely's will in 1829. The Longhouse Granary provided an important structure for storing grains produced on the farm, as well as the livestock of the plantation. Built in about 1845, the Longhouse Granary housed wheat and grains on the second floor, and 4 low openings on the southwest side served as entrances to pig runs for the pigs. A wooden fence would have kept the livestock from going near the dairy. John and Eliza Ridgely, the third owners, had this building constructed out of stone to minimize the threat of fire and reduce periodic maintenance. Their rebuilding effort at the home farm and slave quarters followed the pattern of the fermi orni, ornamental farm style that they had seen on a grand tour of Europe taken in the 1840s. The addition of ornamental trim work, false chimneys, like the one on the roof of the Hampton Dairy, and stonework created a visually appealing scene from the vantage point of the mansion for the Ridgeleys and their guests. Today, the building is not open to the public, but can be viewed from the outside. These are the corn crib foundations. The corn crib was a storage location where the fruits of the labor of enslaved people and paid farmers were stored to dry out in order to make corn-based products. Originally built between 1845 and 1860, the wooden corn crib was once a large one-story wooden gabled structure used to air-dry corn before it was ground into cornmeal. This building burned in a fire in 1989. In 1997 to 1998, the Park Service stabilized and capped the foundation walls to continue to include this structure and its story in the narrative of Hampton Home Farm. In 1855, corn was the most widely grown crop in the United States, and Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia were the breadbasket of America. Husking parties were major events in the antebellum South. I think somewhere in the video I mentioned that the Ridley had brought home from Lebanon a cedar tree and put it on his property. I do not know if I can get this thing in the frame, but I asked around and here it is. That is the cedar of Lebanon that was brought home by the owner of this plantation. Rather impressive, I believe. Now, cedars of Lebanon. Read about them in the Bible, never saw one. So that was actually, I think, the highlight of our tour there for me. And if you're wondering where the Ridgeleys got their money, it was from the Hampton Iron Works. Yes, they did have some farmland, but that was not the major source of money coming in. And I think one thing that most people don't think about is when we think about slavery, well, there were the slaves that worked in the fields, there were the house slaves, but approximately 10% of all slaves in the United States worked in manufacturing industries. So the Hampton Iron Works used a lot of slavery to build up that wealth that you saw on display in this video. Well, hope you found the video interesting. If so, as I mentioned before, that little button down there to subscribe, maybe give it a thumbs up, hit the notification bell, and leave some comments. I'd like to hear what you think of the video. And as usual, have yourself a blessed day.